"Traitor!" Vernon Baxter roared, his cigar smoke curling like a snake as he stormed into Nadie's tent. The Ojibwe beadworker froze, her fingers trembling over a half-finished necklace, as Baxter's sneer pinned her in place. When her drunken brother Migizi stumbled in with water, Baxter's boot sent him sprawling and Nadie's rage exploded. She hurled the necklace, grazing Baxter's cheek, igniting a firestorm of accusations that threatened to burn her world to ash. Nadie, a 23-year-old Ojibwe woman in 1920 Minnesota, weaves intricate bead necklaces that carry her people's stories, but her heart aches under the weight of her reality. Trapped in a white-run circus, she performs as a savage princess, her art reduced to cheap props for gawking crowds. Her brother Migizi, 17 and scarred from boarding school abuse, drowns his pain in whiskey, pushing Nadie to save him while guarding her heritage. Her secret love for Henry, a white musician, sparks hope but draws scorn from both their worlds, leaving Nadie torn between saving her brother, her culture, and her heart. Nadie sat cross-legged in her tent, the flicker of an oil lamp casting shadows on the canvas walls. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, threading tiny beads onto a necklace, each one a whisper of Ojibwe stories her grandmother once told. The distant roar of the circus crowd grated against her ears, a reminder of her role as their exotic savage. She glanced at the empty cot where Migizi should be, her heart sinking with worry. Had he stumbled into another saloon? She counted the coins in a tin box, her savings for his treatment, but they were far too few. A white woman peeked into the tent, her lips curling as she muttered, "Just trinkets for savages." Nadie's chest tightened, but she swallowed the hurt, whispering a prayer to her ancestors for strength. Her beads were more than trinkets. They were her people's soul, and she would not let them be mocked. The tent flap swung open, and Vernon Baxter's heavy boots thudded against the dirt floor. His cigar smoke choked the air, and his eyes glinted with disdain as he loomed over Nadie. "These necklaces are too fancy," he barked, jabbing a finger at her work. "Make them cheap and fast, or you're out." Nadie's hands froze, her pulse racing as she met his gaze. Before she could answer, Migizi staggered in, a water jug sloshing in his trembling hands, his eyes glassy from whiskey. Baxter sneered, "Look at this drunken Indian fool." Nadie leaped to her feet, her voice sharp as she demanded an apology. Baxter laughed, waving her off, saying Migizi was a waste of space. Migizi's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling with shame. Nadie's heart pounded with fury, her fingers clutching the beads as she stood between her brother and the man who mocked him. Nadie's voice trembled but held firm as she faced Baxter. "These necklaces are my people's art, not your cheap toys." Her words echoed her grandmother's teachings, each bead a sacred thread of Ojibwe history. Baxter's lips twisted into a mocking grin. "Your people? The audience wants fake Indian junk, not your nonsense." Nadie's eyes flicked to Migizi, his head bowed, his hands shaking. She thought of her promise to save him, but also of her duty to her heritage. "I won't betray my art," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Baxter's face darkened, his cigar glowing like an angry ember. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the lamplight, and Nadie felt the weight of his power over her life. Yet she stood tall, her beads glinting in defiance, refusing to let him strip her of her pride. Baxter's hand shot out, snatching Nadie's necklace and hurling it to the ground. Beads scattered like broken dreams as he crushed them under his boot. "You're done if you don't obey," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "I'll have the sheriff lock you up for being a troublemaking Indian." Nadie's breath caught, her mind racing with images of iron bars and Migizi left alone. Baxter smirked, mentioning Judge Garrett, his ally in town, who would side with him. Nadie glanced at Migizi, his eyes wide with fear, and her heart twisted at the thought of failing him. "Choose!" Baxter spat, turning to leave. Your beads or your brother. The tent felt smaller, the air thick with his threat. Nadie knelt, gathering the scattered beads, her fingers trembling as she fought the panic rising in her throat. Henry burst into the tent, his violin case swinging, his face pale with worry. "Nadie, I heard Baxter yelling. Are you all right?" His kind eyes searched hers, offering a flicker of warmth in the cold tension. Nadie shook her head, her voice cracking as she recounted Baxter's insults to Migizi. Henry's jaw tightened, and he called Baxter a greedy bully who exploited everyone. He knelt beside Migizi, still crumpled on the ground, and promised to find him if he ran off again. Nadie felt a rush of gratitude but pulled her hand away when Henry reached for it, afraid someone might see their forbidden bond. "I'll talk to the others," Henry said, standing. "We'll stand up to him." As he left, Nadie's heart fluttered with hope, but fear lingered, knowing Baxter's wrath could crush them all. Baxter stormed back into the tent, his face red with rage, spotting Henry's lingering presence. "You're conspiring, aren't you?" he bellowed, shoving Migizi as the boy tried to stand. Migizi crashed to the ground, the water jug shattering, his cry piercing Nadie's heart. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she helped him up, his body trembling with fear. Baxter laughed, a cruel sound, saying, "This boy's as useless as his sister." Henry stepped forward, his fists clenched, shouting for Baxter to stop. Migizi's eyes darted wildly, and before Nadie could grab him, he bolted out of the tent, vanishing into the night. Nadie's scream echoed after him, her chest heaving with panic as she realized her brother was gone, lost to the darkness and his demons. Nadie stood frozen, the shattered jug at her feet, her brother's absence a knife in her chest. She clutched the half-finished necklace, its beads warm in her palm, and turned on Baxter. "You're a thief of our spirit!" she cried, her voice raw with fury. In a flash of rage, she flung the necklace at him, the beads striking his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Baxter roared, clutching his face, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll pay for this, Indian," he snarled, storming out to summon Amos, his enforcer. Henry grabbed Nadie's arm, his voice urgent. "You've got to hide." But Nadie's legs felt heavy, her mind reeling with guilt for striking Baxter and fear for Migizi, lost in the night. The tent seemed to close in, the lamplight flickering like her fading hope. Baxter's shouts echoed outside as he rallied Amos, his voice dripping with venom. "That Indian attacked me! Get the sheriff!" Amos spread the word through the circus, twisting the tale into Nadie's savage assault. Nadie's heart pounded as whispers of her being a wanted woman reached her ears. Henry urged her to flee, his eyes wide with fear, but Nadie shook her head, thinking of Migizi alone in the dark. A kind trapeze artist slipped into the tent, whispering that Migizi was seen near the woods. Nadie's guilt surged. Her outburst had endangered them both. She grabbed her shawl, determined to find her brother before the sheriff's men arrived. The air outside was thick with tension, the circus lights casting long shadows as Nadie stepped into the night, her resolve battling her fear. Nadie sat on the cot, her hands shaking as she stared at the broken beads scattered across the floor. Two paths loomed before her: obey Baxter, make cheap necklaces, and save Migizi, or flee to protect her art, abandoning her brother. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Never let our stories be stolen. But Migizi's frightened face haunted her, his need for her stronger than ever. She thought of Henry, his quiet strength, and wondered if he could help her find a way. The weight of Baxter's threat pressed down, the sheriff's shadow looming closer. Nadie clutched a single bead, its smooth surface grounding her. She stood, resolve hardening. She would find Migizi first, then face the impossible choice, praying her ancestors would guide her through the storm. Nadie ran into the woods, the cold air biting her skin as she called Migizi's name. Branches snagged her dress, tearing the fabric, but she pushed forward, her breath ragged. A faint sob led her to a clearing, where Migizi sat huddled under a pine, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice slurred, the stench of whiskey heavy on him. Nadie knelt, wrapping her arms around him, her heart breaking at his pain. She promised to get him help, her voice fierce with love. Migizi clung to her, his body shaking, and Nadie realized he needed treatment now, or he'd slip further away. She helped him stand, guiding him back to the tent, her mind racing with plans to save him, even if it meant facing Baxter's wrath. Back in the tent, Nadie brewed tea over a small fire, the steam rising like a fragile hope. She handed Migizi a tin cup, her eyes soft but urgent as she urged him to drink. His hands shook, the tea spilling slightly, and he mumbled about the boarding school, where fists and cruel words had broken him. "I'm a burden," he whispered, his voice heavy with shame. Nadie knelt before him, her heart aching, and spoke of their grandmother's dream to keep Ojibwe art alive, her words a lifeline to pull him back. She promised to find a way to get him to a healing place, even if it cost her everything. Migizi's eyes met hers, a faint smile breaking through his pain, the first she'd seen in months. Nadie's chest swelled with love, but Baxter's threat loomed like a storm cloud, darkening her resolve. She hugged Migizi tightly, vowing to protect him, her tears mixing with the warmth of the firelight. Nadie led Migizi through the dawn mist to the Ojibwe camp, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. She found Wabun, the elder, by a ceremonial fire, his face stern under a woven hat. Nadie pleaded for help, explaining Migizi's sickness and her fight to save him. Wabun's eyes narrowed, his voice cold as he accused her of selling their sacred art to the circus. She stood tall, her voice trembling but clear, insisting she worked only to keep Migizi alive. Wabun shook his head, saying she must prove her loyalty to the tribe, and turned away, leaving her standing in the smoke. Nadie's shoulders sagged, the rejection cutting deep, but she gripped Migizi's hand, determined to find another way. As they walked back, she whispered to her ancestors, begging for strength to carry the weight of her brother's life and her people's legacy. Nadie returned to the circus tent, her hands heavy as she picked up a needle and thread. She began crafting a simple necklace, each stitch a betrayal of her grandmother's teachings, her heart twisting with guilt. Migizi's face flashed in her mind, his fragile smile fueling her sacrifice. She finished the crude piece, its plain beads mocking her skill, and tears stung her eyes as she set it aside. Henry slipped into the tent, his face soft with concern, and sat beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He saw the necklace and understood her pain, his hand brushing hers briefly, sparking warmth she dared not linger on. Nadie handed the necklace to Baxter later, his smirk a knife in her chest, but the coins he tossed her were a step toward Migizi's healing. She clutched them, swearing to herself she'd find a way to honor her art again, her resolve burning beneath her shame. Henry lingered in the tent after dusk, his voice low as he shared stories of his childhood, a world far from the circus's cruelty. Nadie listened, her heart easing, and admitted her fear of losing her art forever, her voice cracking with vulnerability. Henry's eyes shone with admiration, calling her the strongest person he knew, and promised to stand against Baxter's greed. He revealed whispers of other artists bullied by Baxter, stirring Nadie's anger anew. She felt a pull toward Henry, his kindness a light in her darkness, but fear of their forbidden bond held her back. He left her a scrap of paper with a drawn musical note, a small gesture that warmed her cold tent. Nadie tucked it away, her heart torn between hope and the looming shadow of Baxter's control, knowing Henry's support was both a comfort and a risk. Nadie used Baxter's coins to take Migizi to a small treatment house on the edge of town, her heart lifting as she walked him through the wooden gate. The doctor, a kind-eyed woman, warned that Migizi's healing would take time and care, her words both a relief and a burden. Nadie hugged Migizi tightly, promising to visit every day, her voice fierce with love. Migizi gripped her hand, his eyes clearer, and said he wanted to make her proud, a spark of the boy he once was. As she left, the sight of him waving from the porch filled her with fragile hope. But back at the tent, the memory of the cheap necklace haunted her, a reminder of her compromise. Nadie knelt by the lamp, praying for Migizi's strength and a path to reclaim her art, her heart, a battlefield of guilt and determination. Nadie stood alone in the tent, the circus music a dull roar outside, as she watched white customers snatch up her simple necklaces. Their laughter, calling them Indian toys, cut deeper than a blade, each word a theft of her heritage. She clutched a photograph of her grandmother, her fingers tracing the proud lines of her face, and whispered an apology for her betrayal. The weight of her sacrifice for Migizi pressed down, her fear of his relapse a constant shadow. Henry appeared, his face gentle, and sat beside her, his silence a balm to her pain. She admitted her guilt, her voice breaking, and he listened, his presence steadying her. Nadie vowed to uncover Baxter's plans, her eyes burning with resolve, knowing she could not let her people's art die. She stood, the photograph in her pocket, ready to fight, her heart fueled by love and loss. Nadie slipped into Baxter's office at midnight, her pulse racing as she rifled through papers by moonlight. Her fingers brushed a necklace, its Ojibwe patterns familiar yet wrong, a crude copy not her own. She gasped, realizing Baxter was stealing her people's designs, her stomach churning with betrayal. Tucked beneath it was a contract, its words chilling, native performers bound to dangerous acts, their art claimed by Baxter. Nadie's hand shook as she read, the scale of his greed dawning on her. She hid the necklace in her shawl, her mind racing with fear and fury. Amos's boots thudded outside, forcing her to duck behind a crate, her heart pounding as he passed. She fled back to her tent, the stolen necklace a burning secret, her resolve hardening to expose Baxter's theft. Nadie pored over the contract in her tent, her lamp casting jagged shadows as she scribbled its details. The words revealed Baxter's plan to mass-produce Ojibwe necklaces in factories, stripping them of their soul. Worse, it enslaved native artists to grueling performances, their lives mere profit. Nadie's chest tightened, imagining her people's art reduced to trinkets, her heritage erased. She thought of the mysterious Beadmaker, his cryptic clues, and wondered if he knew this truth. The contract's weight felt like chains on her own wrists, her fear mingling with rage. She hid the papers under the floorboards, her hands trembling, knowing discovery meant ruin. Nadie sat back, her breath uneven, vowing to tell Henry and fight, her heart a drumbeat of defiance against Baxter's empire. Nadie met Henry behind the big top, the night air thick with tension, and poured out her discovery, her voice low and urgent. The stolen necklace and contract lay heavy in her hands, proof of Baxter's monstrous plan to exploit her people. Henry's face paled, his fists clenching as he cursed Baxter's greed, promising to help her stop him. He suggested finding a federal reporter, someone beyond Baxter's reach, to expose the truth. Nadie hesitated, her fear of retaliation sharp, but Henry's steady gaze gave her courage. He admitted seeing Baxter with a stranger, likely a factory man, fueling her suspicion of a larger scheme. They agreed to gather more proof, their whispers a pact in the dark. Nadie's heart raced, torn between hope and dread, knowing this fight could cost her everything but was worth every risk. Nadie trailed Baxter through the Minnesota dusk, her shawl pulled tight to blend into the shadows. She followed him to a smoky tavern, her heart pounding as she peered through a grimy window. Baxter sat with a man in a fine suit, Carter, their voices low as they pored over papers. Baxter boasted of a grand plan to flood markets with Ojibwe necklaces, his laugh cold and greedy. Carter nodded, promising machines to churn out thousands, and Nadie's stomach twisted at the theft of her people's soul. She scribbled their words on a scrap of paper, her hand shaking with rage. Amos appeared at the tavern door, his eyes scanning the street, forcing Nadie to duck behind a barrel, her breath shallow. She slipped back to the tent, the weight of their scheme fueling her resolve to stop them, her heart a storm of fear and defiance. Henry sat alone by the river, the moonlight glinting off his violin as he wrestled with his choice. Helping Nadie could cost him his job, his only way to support his aging parents. Her fierce spirit flashed in his mind, her pain over her art stirring his heart. He scratched a letter to a reporter, his pen hesitating, then pressed on, inspired by his father's tales of standing for what's right. Henry clenched his jaw, vowing to protect Nadie, no matter the cost. He tucked the letter away, his fear battling a growing courage. Finding Nadie at the tent, he swore to fight beside her, his voice steady, his heart alight with purpose. She smiled faintly, and he felt the weight of their shared battle, a bond deeper than words. Amos prowled outside Nadie's tent, his boots scuffing the dirt, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He slipped inside when she left, tossing her belongings, searching for proof of her defiance. His fingers found a carved bead, its strange markings puzzling him, but he pocketed it, sensing trouble. He reported to Baxter, calling Nadie a sneaky Indian stirring up problems. Nadie returned, her heart sinking as she noticed her scattered things, the bead gone. She knelt, checking the hidden contract, relief washing over her when it was still there, but fear gripped her at Amos's closeness. She warned Henry, her voice tight, urging him to watch his back. Nadie lit the lamp, its glow weak against the dread coiling in her chest, knowing Amos was a hound on her trail. Nadie and Henry crept into Baxter's office under a starless sky, the air thick with risk. They sifted through files, their breaths shallow, until Nadie found a ledger detailing Carter's factory plans. Henry uncovered a letter from Carter, promising funds for native performer contracts, its words cold and calculating. Nadie's hands trembled, her anger flaring at the betrayal of her people. They copied the documents, their fingers smudged with ink, every creak of the floorboards spiking their fear. Footsteps echoed outside, and they dove behind a desk, hearts racing as Amos's shadow passed. They escaped with the papers, the evidence of burning weight in Nadie's shawl. Back in the tent, she clutched the documents, her resolve steeling, ready to strike at Baxter's empire. Nadie and Henry huddled in a barn, the scent of hay masking their whispers as they prepared their evidence. Nadie wrote a letter to a federal reporter, her words fierce, detailing Baxter's theft and enslavement plans. Henry sealed the package, his savings spent on postage, his face set with determination. They slipped to the post office at dawn, disguised in plain clothes, Nadie's heart pounding as she handed over the parcel. The clerk's nod felt like a small victory, but Nadie's fear of Baxter's reach lingered. Henry squeezed her hand, a silent promise, and they parted, the weight of their act settling in. Nadie returned to the tent, praying the reporter would act swiftly, her hope fragile against the looming threat of discovery. Amos ambushed Henry after a show, dragging him into a dark stable, his fists heavy with menace. He slammed Henry against a wall, demanding to know about the office break-in, his voice a low growl. Henry played dumb, his jaw tight, even as Amos's punches bruised his ribs. Amos tied him to a post, sneering he'd tell Baxter everything, leaving Henry gasping in pain. Henry's thoughts clung to Nadie, his fear for her safety sharper than his wounds. He tugged at the ropes, his wrists raw, desperate to warn her. Amos's boots faded into the night, and Henry prayed Nadie was safe, his heart a drumbeat of defiance, vowing to fight on for her cause. Nadie's blood ran cold when a juggler whispered that Henry was missing. She raced to the stable, her breath catching at the sight of him, bound and bloodied, his eyes fierce despite the pain. She cut the ropes, her hands trembling, and helped him stand, her heart breaking at his sacrifice. They hid behind hay bales as Amos's voice echoed nearby, searching for Henry. Nadie whispered apologies, guilt flooding her for dragging him into danger. But Henry shook his head, his voice firm, saying he chose this fight. They slipped out, the knight their shield, and Nadie bandaged his wounds in her tent, her touch gentle but her resolve fierce. She swore to protect him, her heart torn between gratitude and fear, knowing their battle was far from over. Baxter summoned Nadie to his wagon, his eyes glinting with malice as he demanded more performances. He waved a sheriff's notice, threatening to have her arrested for the attack on him, his voice dripping with triumph. Nadie's stomach churned, her freedom hanging by a thread, but she nodded, hiding her defiance. Baxter cut her pay, his smirk cruel, believing he'd broken her. She thought of Migizi, his healing her only anchor, and vowed to outsmart Baxter. Leaving the wagon, she felt his gaze like a noose, her fear sharp but her will sharper. Nadie clutched the hidden contract, her heart pounding with the need to end his reign, her steps steady despite the storm within. Nadie visited Migizi at the treatment house, her heart lifting at his brighter eyes and steadier hands. He showed her a drawing of a bird, his voice soft as he spoke of wanting to weave beads like her. Nadie hugged him, tears welling, promising he'd soar again, her love a fierce shield. The doctor praised his progress but cautioned he needed more time, a reminder of Nadie's burden. She shared vague tales of the circus, shielding him from Baxter's threat, her smile hiding her fear. Migizi gave her a small stone, a token of his hope, and Nadie clutched it, her heart swelling. Leaving, she prayed he'd stay strong, a resolve to defeat Baxter burning brighter, fueled by her brother's fragile recovery. Nadie stood in the tent, her lamp flickering as she crafted another cheap necklace, each bead a stab of guilt. She overheard white patrons mocking her work, their words like thorns tearing at her pride. Henry slipped in, his bruises fading, and sat close, his warmth easing her pain. She confessed her fear of failing Migizi, her voice trembling, and he listened, his eyes steady with faith in her. Nadie pulled out the stolen contract, her resolve reigniting, vowing to expose Baxter's crimes. Henry suggested watching Baxter's meetings, his voice calm but determined. She nodded, her heart a mix of dread and courage, knowing each step deeper into this fight risked everything. Nadie gripped the contract, her grandmother's spirit urging her on, ready to reclaim her people's honor. Nadie walked through the Ojibwe camp at dusk, the scent of sage from a ceremonial fire filling the air. She stood before the elders, her voice steady as she begged to hold a gathering to expose Baxter's theft of their art. Holding the stolen necklace aloft, she spoke of its sacred patterns, now mocked by greedy hands, her words trembling with passion. Some nodded, their eyes softening, but others whispered doubts, stung by her circus ties. Wabun, the elder, demanded proof of her loyalty, his gaze sharp. Nadie promised to unveil Baxter's crimes, her heart pounding with hope and fear. The elders agreed to the ceremony, but their wary glances lingered. As she left, clutching Migizi's stone, Nadie felt the weight of her people's trust, vowing to prove her heart belonged to them. Nadie met Wabun alone by the river, the water's murmur a faint comfort against his stern words. He questioned her time with the circus, calling her work a betrayal of their ancestors. Nadie's chest ached, but she explained her fight for Migizi, her voice breaking as she spoke of his pain. Wabun recounted a lost artisan, cheated by white men, his tone heavy with warning. He demanded hard evidence of Baxter's wrongs, his eyes unyielding. Nadie nodded, promising to deliver, though his doubt cut deep. She walked away, the river's flow mirroring her swirling fears. Yet Migizi's stone in her pocket anchored her resolve. She whispered to her grandmother's spirit, begging for strength to win Waban's trust and save her people's art. The ceremony began under a starry sky, the camp alive with drums and firelight. Nadie stood at the center, her voice rising as she revealed Baxter's plan to steal Ojibwe designs and enslave their artists. She held up the stolen necklace, its beads glinting, a symbol of their violated heritage. The crowd stirred, some cheering, others murmuring doubt. Judge Garrett stormed in with deputies, his voice booming that the gathering was illegal. Chaos erupted as deputies pushed through, scattering families. Migizi, fresh from the treatment house, rushed to Nadie's side but was struck by a deputy's club, crumpling to the ground. Nadie screamed, shielding him, her heart shattering as blood trickled from his temple, her fury and fear colliding in a desperate cry for her people to stand firm. Nadie carried Migizi to her tent, his shallow breaths, a knife in her chest. She cleaned his wound, her hands trembling, tears falling as she whispered apologies for bringing him into danger. Migizi stirred, his voice weak but firm, saying he believed in her fight, his words a fragile spark of hope. Nadie clutched his hand, her guilt a heavy weight, feeling she'd failed her brother and her tribe. She looked at the stolen necklace, its beads accusing her of weakness, and sobbed, fearing all was lost. Henry slipped in, his face pale, offering a quiet strength as he sat beside her. Nadie vowed to keep fighting, her voice hoarse, her love for Migizi fueling her shattered resolve. She kissed his forehead, praying he'd heal, her heart a storm of grief and determination. The Beadmaker appeared at the tent's edge, his shadowed figure startling Nadie as he handed her a carved bead, its markings a map. He whispered of a hidden cache of Baxter's documents, his voice low and urgent, urging her to follow. Nadie hesitated, fearing a trap, but his eyes held a familiar pain, like her own. She followed him through the woods, the bead's weight guiding her to a buried box. Inside were letters proving Baxter's deals with Carter, each word a dagger to her heart. The Beadmaker vanished, leaving her alone with the truth. Nadie clutched the papers, her fear mingling with hope, knowing this could break Baxter. She hid them in her shawl, her resolve burning, ready to risk everything to save her people's legacy. Nadie sent the new documents to a federal agent through a trusted courier, her heart racing as she wrote a plea for justice. The agent's reply came swiftly, promising a swift investigation, a flicker of light in her darkness. She hid the reply under her cot, her hands shaking with hope and dread. Baxter's shadow loomed larger, his men watching her every move. Nadie visited Migizi, his slow recovery a painful reminder of her stakes, and she held his hand, hiding her fear. She prayed the agent would act before Baxter struck back, her nights sleepless with worry. Henry checked on her, his steady presence a lifeline, and Nadie clung to the dream of a free Migizi and a saved heritage, her heart a fragile flame against the coming storm. Nadie learned Carter had burned the document cache, the news a punch to her gut. She ran to the site, finding only ashes and charred wood, her hope crumbling with each step. A local whispered of Carter's men torching it at dawn, their laughter echoing in her mind. Nadie knelt. Her hands were covered in soot. Tears streaked down her face, and she worried that all the evidence was lost. She clutched the agent's letter, praying that the document sent was strong enough, her heart filled with doubt. Baxter's power seemed unshakable, his force suffocating her. Nadie stood up, wiped away her tears, her resolve weak but alive, and she vowed to find another way to expose him. She walked back, the wind carrying her whispered prayers to her ancestors for guidance. Nadie and Henry met in secret, their voices hushed, to plan a protest at the next circus performance. Nadie wrote a speech, her words raging, calling for justice for her people's art. Henry rallied sympathetic performers, his quiet courage steadying her nerves. They made signs that read, "Save Ojibwe arts," their hands stained with paint, their hearts united. Nadie's fear of Baxter's wrath battled with her hope for change, her mind racing with risk. She thought of Migizi, the rock in his pocket, a reminder of her struggle. They rehearsed their plan, each step a rebellion against Baxter's empire, their bond a shield against the coming storm. Nadie's heart pounded, her resolve of fire ready to ignite the truth before the crowd. Henry confronts Baxter in the marquee, his voice ringing as he refuses to play his violin. Baxter's face contorts as he shouts, "You're fired!" The sound echoes through the marquee. Henry stands straight, accusing Baxter of exploiting indigenous artists, his words carrying the sharp edge of truth. Baxter lunges, his fist striking Henry's cheek, leaving an instant red mark. Henry doesn't flinch, his eyes blazing as he declares that the truth will eventually come out. Baxter orders Amos to follow him, his sneer foreboding pain. Henry leaves, his heart racing but unbroken, knowing that his stand for Nadie was worth any price. He finds her, his bruises a badge of honor, Nadie's touch of his face stirring a quiet strength, their shared struggle bringing them closer together. Baxter rushed to the treatment facility, his boots heavy as he advanced on Migizi in the yard. He looked down at the boy and threatened to hurt him if Nadie didn't stop her messing around, his voice a vicious hiss. Migizi's eyes widened, but he stood firm, feigning fear while remembering Baxter's words. He slipped a note to the nurse, warning Nadie, his hand steady despite his racing heartbeat. Baxter left a scribbled, threatening note, thinking he had frightened Migizi into silence. Migizi later told Nadie, his voice full of pride, that he wanted to help her win. Nadie hugged him. Her heart swelled with his courage, but sank with fear for his safety. She vowed to end Baxter's reign, her love for Migizi, a burning flame that pushed her forward. The Beadmaker stepped into the firelight of Nadie's tent, pulling back his hood to reveal a scarred face, his eyes heavy with shared pain. He called himself Joseph, an Ojibwe artisan once bound by Carter's cruel contracts, his voice low with memory. He spoke of years lost to exploitation, his hands crafting art for thieves, and Nadie's heart ached, seeing her own fears in his story. He handed her a list of witnesses, fellow artists ready to testify against Carter, their names a spark of hope. Joseph promised to stand with her at the protest, his resolve mirroring hers. Nadie gripped the list, her fear easing, feeling the strength of an ally who understood her fight. She thanked him, tears in her eyes, her heart swelling with the chance to right their people's wrongs. As he left, she clutched Migizi's stone, ready to face the coming storm. Nadie rallied the Ojibwe camp, her voice fierce as she urged them to join the circus protest, the stolen necklace raised like a banner. Waboon stepped forward, his doubt softened, but he insisted she lead, his eyes testing her courage. Henry gathered circus workers, their nods a quiet alliance, their hands busy with signs demanding justice. Nadie painted, "Protect our art," on cloth, her fingers trembling with purpose, each stroke a defiance of Baxter. She thought of Migizi, his recovery fragile, and vowed to win for him. They practiced their march, footsteps echoing like a drumbeat, their unity a shield against fear. Nadie wore Migizi's beaded gift, its weight grounding her, her heart pounding with the hope of reclaiming her people's pride. The circus tent buzzed with anticipation, the crowd unaware of the storm brewing. Nadie stormed the stage, seizing the megaphone, her voice thundering as she exposed Baxter's theft of Ojibwe art and enslavement of her people. She held up the stolen necklace, its beads flashing, a silent cry of her heritage. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others shouting in shock, as signs rose around her. Baxter roared from the sidelines, his face purple, demanding silence. Henry led workers to block the exits, their chants drowning Baxter's threats. Nadie's heart raced, her words a wildfire, igniting fury in the crowd as they turned on Baxter. She stood tall, Migizi's stone in her pocket, her spirit soaring with the truth's power, unafraid of the chaos she'd unleashed. Judge Garrett burst through the tent flaps, his badge gleaming, deputies at his heels, shouting that Nadie's protest was a crime. He pointed at her, ordering her arrest, his voice cold with authority. The Ojibwe closed ranks around her, their faces fierce, refusing to yield. Circus workers joined, forming a human wall, their shouts defying Garrett's men. Garrett's hand hovered over his gun, his threats sharp, but the crowd's roar shook the tent. Nadie kept speaking, her voice unbroken, calling for justice for her people's art. Deputies hesitated, outnumbered, as the crowd's anger surged like a tide. Nadie's heart pounded, her fear swallowed by the strength of her people, knowing this moment could change everything or destroy her. Amos leaped onto the stage, his pistol glinting, a shot cracking into the air, silencing the crowd. He aimed at Nadie, his snarl promising death, his eyes wild with loyalty to Baxter. Migizi, frail but fierce, broke through the crowd, shoving Nadie aside as Amos fired again. The bullet struck Migizi's chest, and he fell, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes locked on Nadie's. She screamed, collapsing beside him, her hands pressing his wound, begging him to stay. The crowd surged, pinning Amos, their shouts a roar of rage. Nadie cradled Migizi, her sobs tearing through her, her world crumbling as his breath faltered. She whispered his name, her heart shattering, praying his sacrifice wasn't the end of their fight. Joseph, the beadmaker, climbed the stage, his voice cutting through the chaos, revealing himself as Carter's former artisan. He presented a witness, a trembling woman with documents proving Baxter and Carter's crimes, her words steady despite fear. The crowd hushed, hanging on her testimony, as she detailed years of stolen art and forced labor. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens capturing the truth Nadie had fought for. Joseph held up a contract, its ink damning, and the crowd roared, demanding justice. Nadie, still clutching Migizi, felt a surge of hope, his sacrifice fueling her resolve. The witness's voice echoed, a beacon in the darkness, and Nadie prayed it was enough to topple Baxter's empire. Federal agents stormed the tent, their badges flashing as they pushed through the crowd, handcuffs ready. They seized Baxter, his protests drowned by the crowd's cheers, his face pale with shock. Garrett struggled as agents cuffed him, his shouts of influence fading into futility. The crowd parted, their chants of victory song, as the men were dragged away. Nadie watched, her heart heavy with Migizi's loss but lifted by justice. Henry knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a silent promise of support. Reporters swarmed, vowing to spread the story, and Nadie felt the weight of her people's vindication. She held Migizi's stone, her resolve unbroken, knowing the fight was won but at a devastating cost. The agents revealed more documents, exposing Carter's role as the factory mastermind behind the stolen designs. His arrest followed, the crowd's cheers echoing as his empire crumbled, the mass production plan scrapped. Native artists were freed from their contracts, their art returned to their hands, a small but vital victory. Nadie stood, her eyes on the horizon, feeling her people's spirit restored. She thought of Migizi, his courage a light in her darkness, and vowed to honor him. The Ojibwe gathered around her, their embrace a homecoming, their trust now hers. Reporters promised front-page stories, and Nadie's heart stirred, knowing her fight had sparked change, even as grief lingered. Migizi's breath stopped as the doctor knelt beside him, his gentle words confirming the worst. Nadie's wail echoed, her arms wrapped around her brother, his lifeless body heavy with her failure. She remembered his smile, his bird drawing, and sobbed. guilt clawing at her for bringing him here. Henry held her, his tears mixing with hers, his warmth a faint anchor in her grief. The Ojibwe began a mourning chant, their voices honoring Migizi's sacrifice, a hero's farewell. Nadie placed his beaded gift in his hand, whispering promises to carry his spirit. She stood, her heart broken but resolute, vowing to protect their art for him. The tent fell silent, Migizi's loss a wound that would never fully heal. Nadie stood before the Ojibwe camp, the stolen necklace in her hands, now a symbol of their reclaimed heritage. Baxter, Garrett, and Carter faced prison, their crimes laid bare, the factories shuttered. The tribe embraced Nadie, their voices calling her a guardian, their trust a balm to her wounds. Henry stood beside her, his quiet strength a promise of a shared future, their love no longer forbidden. Migizi's sacrifice burned in her heart, his stone a constant reminder to keep fighting. The Ojibwe planned a memorial, their unity stronger than ever, their art safe. Nadie looked to the sky, feeling her brother's spirit, her resolve aflame to honor their legacy. The fight was over, but her journey to heal and rebuild had just begun.